Hello. Today I'll be talking about the history and development of the FPGA. I'm Kevin McMahon, professor at Dr. Maduri. So this slide provides a general overview of topics that I will be covering for this presentation. The MOSFET was invented in 1969 by Dewan Khan and John Atawa. They filed their patent for the technology on May 31st, 1960, and their patent was granted on August 27th, 1963. The figure shown shows a diagram of the first MOSFET. This picture was taken directly from their patent and was labeled as Figure 1A in their patent. Technology for transistor logic was invented in 1961 by a man named James Bowie. The patent was granted on August 27, 1963. The two figures are directly from Bowie's patent. The top figure was labeled Figure 7 and the bottom figure was labeled Figure 8 in his patent. Both circuits in the figures implement the logic equation S equals AB naught plus A naught B. The top figure shows the logic equation using direct coupling. The bottom figure shows the logic equation using transistor logic. As is evident from the figures, the utilizing the transistor logic requires less components to be needed and fewer lead connections to be needed. Another important advantage was that there was less of a propagation delay for transistor logic. Moore founded Fairchild Semiconductor and became the director of its research and development laboratories for the company. Moore would then go on to become a co-founder of Intel in 1968. In 1965, Moore noted that the number of components per integrated circuit for a given area had been doubling each year. As a result of this observation, he predicted that this trend of doubling the number would remain roughly the same for the near future, if not increase. While he believed that this trend would not last forever, he predicted that it would last at least 10 more years after 1965. The plot shown shows an illustration of this prediction where the number of components per integrated circuit is plotted against the years. The dotted line represents his prediction for the future years after 1965. In 1975, Moore revisited his prediction that he had made in 1965. As a result of some limitations he foresaw on future technology, Moore modified his prediction in 1975 to assume that the number of components per chip would double every 2 years, as opposed to the previous prediction of the number doubling every year. By the early 1980s, the technology of semiconductors had advanced to the point that the number of transistors that could be put on a chip was large enough to be useful, to be specialized for customer applications. These customized integrated circuits became known as application-specific integrated circuits. By the mid-1980s, as companies were making ASICs, the picture shown is an example of an ASIC. Wen-Sing Chao is a man responsible for inventing what is known currently as programmable read-only memory. Chao's work on what he called a storage matrix was filed by him for a patent on December 27, 1957, and was patented on April 10, 1962. Chao's invention proposes to prepare a matrix having an electrical element at each crossover point in the laboratory or shop, and then to remove unwanted elements in the field by physically disconnecting or electrically burning out the unwanted elements. The figure shows one of the three figures that Chao drew as a reference to explain his invention. This picture was taken directly from his patent and was labeled as Figure 1 in his patent. On June 15, 1970, Dodd-Frohman filed a patent for what would become known as the erasable programmable read-only memory, and his patent was granted on May 2, 1972. Frohman proposed a way in which the charge in the gate of a transistor could be removed when the transistor was exposed to X-rays or UV light. The previous technology for a floating gate transistor had multiple drawbacks, which made it practically impossible with the current knowledge at the time to produce the transistor. The cross-section of the floating gate transistor invented by Frohman is shown here and was taken directly from Frohman's patent, where it is referenced as Figure 2 in the patent itself. In 1967, Sven Wallström proposed the first stack random access memory FPGA in his paper, Programmable Logic Arrays, Cheaper by the Millions. However, because of cost, SRAM FPGAs were not introduced until 1985 by Xilinx. The first FPGA was the SRAM-based XC2064 from Xilinx. The figure shown here is of the XC2064 from Xilinx. On February 22, 1977, Eliyahu Harari filed a patent for what would become known as the electrically erasable programmable read-only memory, and his patent was granted on September 26, 1978. The device that was invented was a non-volatile one in which an electrically floating gate was used to store a charge. The charges can make their way to the floating gate in one of two ways. These two ways are mentioned by Harari as being either tunneling or avalanche injection. The charges are then contained and stored in the gate, thereby creating memory within the gate. The most important part of his invention was perhaps the ability to remove the charges from these gates. The figure shown portrays the cross-sectional view of what Harari calls the completed structure of his invention and is shown as figure 3I in his patent. On November 13, 1981, Fujio Mizuoka and Hisaku Izuka filed a patent entitled Semiconductor Memory Device and Method for Manufacturing the Same, which was granted on July 23, 1985. This patent identified improvements that were made to the idea of EEPROM with the introduction of what became referred to as flash memory. The figure pictured here shows a circuit diagram of 4 flash memory cells taken from their patent, which was referenced as figure 6 in their patent. What was advertised as the first PLA that can be programmed electrically in the field was the IM5200 FPLA. This device was designed by Bill Sivers and was introduced in June of 1975. The device was a dual inline package consisting of 24 pins and internally had 14 inputs and 8 outputs. The figure pictured here shows the IM5200, the FPLA, designed by Sivers. On May 23, 1977, John Berkner and Hua Thai Chua filed a patent for a new technology that they had invented called a programmable array logic circuit. The patent was issued to the two inventors on November 7, 1978. The programmable array logic is composed of an array of circuit inputs and a number of inputs into a plethora of AND gates. The outputs of the AND gates are then fed into OR gates. This setup incorporates an ability for the designer to choose which inputs go into the AND gates, making them programmable. The inputs into the OR gates, however, cannot be manipulated by the designer, making them unprogrammable. This causes an important trade-off to be made using programmable array logic over field programmable logic arrays. The use of unprogrammable inputs into the OR gates creates a limitation on the design flexibility of the circuit. However, according to Berkner and Chua, this downgrade is more than made up for by the decrease in the size of the chip for the integrated circuit. This reduction in chip size leads to a better yield and therefore leads to a reduction in cost. The figure shown here portrays a programmable array logic circuit that has not yet been configured and is represented as figure 1 in their patent. An improvement to the patent was the invention by Lattice Semiconductor of the generic array logic device. The device brought the capability of easy reprogrammability. The figures shown here is of examples of Lattice Semiconductor generic array logic devices. Around the same time as when the FPGA was introduced, Altera came up with a new device referred to as a complex programmable logic device. Altera's first CPLDs were the MAX 5000 devices, which were introduced in the year 1988. The CPLD is composed of several PAL-type blocks with connections among them. At the time, there were 2 advantages that the CPLD had over the existing FPGAs. The CPLD allowed for fewer stages needed to be implemented for certain functions compared to existing FPGAs. Another advantage of CPLDs over the existing FPGAs was that the timing was much more predictable. The predictability came from the known delays for PALs no matter what logical expression was used, as long as the PAL was able to fit onto a microcell. Since CPLDs were a series of PALs put together, it would be very simple to predict the total delay that would result. The existing FPGAs, the timing was unpredictable depending on how the design was mapped and the delay at each interconnect. The first FPGA was introduced in 1985 by Xilinx co-founders Ross Freeman and Bernard Vanderschmidt. Their pictures are seen here with Freeman on the left and Vanderschmidt on the right. Scientist and author Stephen Trimberger defines a field programmable gate array as a general-purpose, multi-level programmable logic device that is customized and packaged by the end users. The FPGA is made up of logic blocks that are attached through interconnects, which are programmable by the user. When FPGAs came out of the scene in the mid-1980s, they were competing with ASICs, PALs, and CPLDs. With respect to ASICs, a big advantage that FPGAs had was that there are virtually no non-recurring engineering costs that would have to be passed on to the consumers. Since the FPGA had no NRE, it was more cost-effective when a smaller number of components were being produced, even though the FPGA unit costs were more than the per-unit ASIC cost at the time. This is the advantage that the FPGA had over the PAL and CPLD was the elimination of the AND array used for programming. This advantage allowed for the FPGA to not be limited by the quadratic growth of the AND array and the wiring layout. There are currently 3 major types of FPGA architectures that are utilized today. They are SRAM-based, flash-based, and anti-fuse-based. SRAM-based FPGAs utilize volatile memory, while flash-based and anti-fuse-based FPGAs utilize non-volatile memory. Some of the companies that have been involved in FPGA production now and in the past include Xilinx, Altera, Lattice Semiconductor, Atmel, QuickLogic, and Actel. According to Trimberg, as of 2015, since FPGAs were introduced, their capacity has grown by more than a factor of 10,000, their performance by a factor of 100, and their cost and energy used per operation has decreased by over a factor of 1,000. This concludes my presentation. Here are my reference slides, and thank you very much.